Sometimes life takes an unexpected turn in a matter of seconds. For me, it happened during the brief 20-second elevator ride from the ground floor to my apartment on the 7th floor. I got on the elevator, my arms laden with grocery bags, thinking about my granddaughter and the delicious Sunday pot roast I was planning to make for dinner. Everything seemed perfectly normal, almost mundane, until the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, and my new neighbor, Lionel Evans, stepped inside. He was a reserved man in his 50s with a gentle voice, always polite when he greeted me. However, on this particular afternoon, he avoided making eye contact. His breathing was shallow and uneven, and his hands visibly trembled. As the elevator doors were about to close, he subtly slipped me a small note, carefully folded into quarters. His fingers brushed against mine, and I immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. I looked up at him, wanting to ask what was going on, but he simply moved his lips, whispering, "Don't say anything." Without thinking, I unfolded the note. It read, "Fake sick and get out of here fast." I froze, completely stunned. My initial reaction was to laugh, to dismiss it as some kind of bizarre joke. But then I looked at his face, pale, tense, like someone who knew they were in imminent danger. My heart began to pound in my chest. I didn't understand what was happening, but a primal instinct told me to trust him. I clutched my chest, pretending to feel dizzy. "Oh dear God," I mumbled, swaying and stumbling. "I don't feel well at all." Lionel immediately pressed the emergency stop button. The elevator came to a halt between floors, and with great effort, he managed to pry the doors open just enough. "Get out, Miss Sterling," he whispered urgently. "Now." And that's exactly what I did. I scrambled out of the elevator, trembling uncontrollably, my grocery bag spilling onto the floor. I leaned against the hallway wall for support as he remained inside, holding the doors open. When our eyes met one last time, I knew beyond any doubt that this wasn't some kind of game. There was genuine, palpable fear in his eyes. Before I continue with my story, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps me to see that you appreciate and enjoy my stories. Also, please leave a comment below and let me know what city you're watching from right now. Now let's get back to the story. Minutes later, the piercing wail of sirens echoed through the street. The sound seemed to originate from the parking garage, and the echoes reverberated off the walls of the condo tower. I looked out my window and saw police cars and an ambulance pulling up. Neighbors began to emerge from their apartments, clearly alarmed. Someone shouted that the elevator was stuck between floors. Another person said that there was blood involved. I couldn't make sense of any of it. I desperately wanted to go downstairs to see what was happening, but my legs refused to cooperate. I sank down onto the hallway floor, trying to process the events that had just unfolded. Lionel, the note, the fear etched on his face. What was he trying to prevent? What did he know that I didn't? A few minutes later, a police officer knocked on my door. "Are you Miss Layla Sterling?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Yes, officer." "What's going on? Did you know the man who was in the elevator with you?" My heart skipped a beat. What happened to him? "He was found dead when the paramedics arrived." I felt a sudden emptiness in the pit of my stomach. Deceased? But I had just been talking to him. The officer lowered his gaze. "It appears that someone attacked him." I couldn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the terrified look on his face. I kept thinking about that note, and how if I hadn't listened to him, I would have been the one lying there. I turned on the lamp and unfolded the note again and again, as if the letters themselves might somehow change. The paper was stained with my sweat. On the back, I noticed something written in faint blue ink. "Don't trust anyone in the building." A shiver ran down my spine. How could that be possible? I've lived here for over 30 years. I know everyone. There's Doris from the 5th floor, who's always borrowing sugar, the Peterson twins, who spend their days arguing, and my daughter-in-law, Kendra, who lives on the 8th floor with my son. I froze, suddenly realizing that my daughter-in-law was the same one I'd had a heated argument with just a week ago about an old family inheritance. The next morning, the police came back to question me again. They wanted to know why Lionel had given me that note. I honestly didn't know what to say. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe he thought I was someone else. But deep down I knew that wasn't the truth. He knew exactly who I was. After the officer left, I found myself alone in my living room. The elevator was still out of service, and the silence in the condo building was deafening. I made a decision right then and there. I wasn't going to just sit around and wait for answers to come to me. Lionel had tried to save my life for a reason, and if that reason had something to do with someone within these very walls, then I wouldn't rest until I found out why someone wanted me dead in that elevator. The following days were filled with an unsettling mixture of silence and hushed whispers. The entire building seemed to breathe differently, as if the walls themselves held the echoes of that horrific crime. Doors slammed shut a little faster, curtains were drawn more discreetly, and the elevators, which had once been a gathering place for neighbors, had now become a place of fear and suspicion. Every time I went up or down the stairs, I had the distinct feeling that eyes were watching me. Some people greeted me with forced politeness. Others simply looked away, avoiding any contact. It was as if everyone knew something that I didn't. The police had visited several times, wanting to know everything I could remember about my encounter with Lionel. I told them everything: his expression, the note, the overwhelming sense of fear. The lead detective, a man with a weary face, listened intently. "And you're saying you didn't know him?" he asked as soon as he greeted me in the hallway. "Interesting," he murmured, glancing down at his notebook, "because we found your name written on a sheet of paper inside his apartment." "My name?" I asked, completely taken aback. "Are you sure? Eris Sterling, 7th floor?" He confirmed, yes. He wrote it next to two other names, but those were crossed out. I honestly didn't know how to respond. The detective studied me for a few more seconds before adding, "Do you know if he had any enemies?" "No," I replied, "but it's starting to look like I do." It was hard for me to fall asleep that night. The clock read 2 a.m. when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I got up silently and pressed my ear against the door. Someone was out there breathing. I felt a knot tighten in my throat. Suddenly I heard something fall. A small white envelope slid under the door. I waited a few moments before cautiously picking it up. There was no return address. With trembling hands I opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a newspaper clipping. The clipping described the assassination of a businessman who had been involved in a financial scandal. On the sheet of paper someone had hastily written, "It all started with your husband's inheritance. Don't trust anyone." I let the paper fall to the floor. My husband, Marcus Sterling, had passed away 6 years ago. The inheritance had been a constant source of conflict with my son and his wife, Kendra. She had been pushing me to sell the family land, but I had adamantly refused. That dispute had severely strained the already fragile relationship we had. What does Marcus have to do with all of this? I wondered softly. The next morning I went down to the building lobby. The neighbors were gathered there, like a flock of crows circling a secret. Doris from the 5th floor looked at me with a curious expression. "Era, have you heard the news? The man who died in the elevator was an accountant. They're saying he worked for a woman who lives on the 8th floor." A shiver went down my spine. "The 8th floor?" "Yes, Kendra Reed. Isn't that your daughter-in-law?" I didn't answer. I simply nodded, trying my best to conceal the trembling in my hands. I returned to my apartment, my mind racing. Lionel, the note, the murder, the accountant. Everything was starting to connect, but I still couldn't quite grasp the whole picture. Later that afternoon, I decided to visit my son's apartment. Darius greeted me with a weary smile. "Mom, what a surprise. Please come in." The apartment was spotless as always. Kendra, his wife, appeared a few seconds later, dressed in a silk robe, her smile cold and calculating. "Nice to see you, mother-in-law. What brings you here?" "I just wanted to know if you'd heard anything about the incident in the elevator," I replied, carefully choosing my words. "Terrible," she said, feigning shock. "Yes, that man was my accountant." I froze, completely stunned. "Your accountant?" "Yes. He handled a few things for me, Minor stuff. Nothing important. She said this while deliberately avoiding eye contact. Darius quickly intervened. Mom, don't start. Please. I'm not starting anything, son. I'm just asking questions. Kendra added with a smile. Honestly, there's nothing suspicious about it. That man probably had enemies. I'm not surprised he ended up like that. I left quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if it was just my imagination, but there was something in her tone, an unsettling certainty, as if she knew more than she was letting on. That night, I went through my husband's old documents. In one of the folders, I found a sheet of paper with a name underlined. Lionel Evans, the same man who had given me the note. And in the margin in my husband's handwriting was written, "Tell Era if something happens to me." My blood ran cold. Lionel had known Marcus. He had been looking out for me on my own husband's orders. And Kendra. What part did she play in all of this? At midnight, I decided to step out into the hallway. I simply couldn't sleep. When I reached the elevator, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. The doors were open, still showing the faint chalk outline from the day of the crime. On the floor, I noticed a small smudge of blue ink. The same ink that had been used to write the note Lionel had given me. I looked up toward the 8th floor, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of a woman watching me from the hallway above, a tall, still shadow wearing a silk robe identical to the one Kendra had been wearing earlier. I retreated slowly, locked my apartment door, and secured the deadbolt. I sat in the darkness, unable to stop thinking. The note, the clipping, my husband's name, the connection with Lionel. Everything pointed to a truth that was just beginning to emerge. And even though fear paralyzed me, something else was growing inside. A suspicion that hurt more than the terror itself. Because if Lionel had been my protector, then the threat had to be coming from someone I loved. 3 days had passed since I had last had a decent night's sleep. Ever since I discovered that Lionel Evans's name was written in my late husband's papers, I couldn't get his face out of my mind. That desperate expression, that note written in blue ink, that warning that had saved my life. It was no longer just a coincidence. It was a message from the past, a past that someone was desperately trying to erase. The entire building seemed to look at me differently now. In the elevator, which had been repaired, no one spoke a word. Everyone lowered their eyes, pretending they knew nothing. But I was watching them. I observed Doris, who spent more and more time peering through her peephole, the Peterson twins, who had suddenly become overly friendly and subservient, and especially Kendra, who feigned cordiality every time I crossed her path, but couldn't quite hide that nervous glint in her eyes. She knew something. I could feel it in my bones. I decided to visit the building maintenance room, where the security cameras were kept. I knew the superintendent, Ethan, a quiet, helpful young man in his 20s. When I asked him to show me the recordings from the day of the murder, he hesitated. "I don't know if I'm supposed to do that, Miss Sterling." "Look, Ethan," I said in a low voice. "That man saved my life. I just need to understand why." Ethan nodded, closed the door, turned on the screen and began to play the images. The video showed the 4th floor hallway. Lionel entering the elevator, then me, and then nothing. The recording stopped just before he handed me the note. "See," Ethan said. "There's a 5-minute gap. And who can access those recordings?" "Only the building manager, and well, some of the owners if they request authorization." "Owners like who, for example, Miss Kendra Reed?" My heart skipped a beat. "My daughter-in-law?" "Yes. She requested access about 2 weeks ago, claiming there had been a theft in her apartment." I didn't say anything. Ethan continued searching through the files and found something else. "Look at this," he said, zooming in on the image. In the 8th floor hallway, barely an hour before the crime, Kendra could be seen entering the building carrying a large black tote bag. 10 minutes later, she was running out. "Could you make me a copy of this?" I asked him. "Of course, but please be careful, ma'am. Not everyone in this building is who they seem." That afternoon, I returned home with the USB stick in my pocket. I looked at it as if it were a ticking time bomb. Proof that something terrible had been happening right under my nose and I hadn't seen it. I turned on my computer and watched the recording over and over again. There was Kendra, her hurried walk, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses, the bag pressed against her body, and something else. As she left the building, she looked up toward my window. Fear mixed with anger washed over me. If Lionel was connected to my husband, and Kendra had been in the building that day, then it hadn't been a random murder. It had been a failed warning, and I had been the intended target all along. I decided to put the evidence in a sealed envelope, along with the note Lionel had given me. I hid them in the false bottom of a drawer. But that night, someone broke into my apartment. The noise woke me up around 2 a.m. It was a faint sound, almost imperceptible, the creak of the floorboards in the living room. I got up without turning on the light, barefoot, my heart pounding 1,000 beats a minute. From the darkness, I saw a shadow move near the desk. I couldn't make out who it was, but I saw the slender feminine silhouette, and in their hand something metallic glinted, a key. I hid behind the door and waited. The shadow opened the drawer, fumbled clumsily, and then hurried out. When I dared to look, the envelope was gone. I went out into the hallway, but no one was there. Only the lingering scent of expensive perfume, the same one Kendra had worn since she married my son. The next morning I called her. "Kendra, I need to talk to you," I said calmly. "I'm busy right now. It will just take a minute. It's about Lionel." There was silence on the other end of the phone. "What does that man have to do with me?" she asked, her voice tense. "You tell me." And then she hung up. That night, fear turned into determination. If someone had stolen the evidence, it meant I was right. It meant that someone was afraid of what I knew. And that person didn't just want to cover their tracks. They wanted to silence me for good. I called Ethan again. "I need you to copy the entire system, all the recordings from the last 3 weeks. "What's going on, Miss Sterling?" he asked. The same thing that always happens when the truth starts to come to light. Fear changes hands. A few hours later, I received an anonymous text message on my cell phone. "Don't look any further. Your curiosity will kill you just like it killed Lionel." The number was unknown. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I felt a cold shiver run through my body. I deleted the message and turned off my phone. I gazed out the window toward the 8th floor, where the light in Kendra's apartment was still on. Behind that window, I knew someone was watching me too. Someone who was no longer afraid to get their hands dirty. And that night I made up my mind. If they wanted to silence me, they were going to have to hear me scream first. The truth doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like water through a crack, until it eventually saturates everything. And when it's too late to stop it, you realize that what you thought was your life was actually a stage where others were pulling all the strings. After receiving that anonymous message, I knew that I couldn't trust anyone. Kendra wasn't answering my calls. Darius, my son, still didn't suspect a thing, and Lionel was still dead. But in every corner of this apartment, something was telling me that his story wasn't over yet. That morning, I went to my husband's study. I hadn't set foot in there since his death. The air smelled of old paper and wood. On his desk, covered in a layer of dust, were folders labeled in his unmistakable handwriting. I opened them one by one until I found a sealed envelope with my name on it. "Era, if something happens to me, find Lionel Evans. He's the only one I trust." A shiver went through me. Everything was connected. Marcus had known him, perhaps even worked with him, but on what? Among the documents, I found a thicker folder marked with a name that I was beginning to hate. Kendra Reed. Inside were copies of contracts, wire transfers, and photographs. And there, finally, the truth began to take shape. My husband had discovered before his death that Kendra and her family had been using shell companies to siphon money from the family assets. Lionel, who had been working as an auditor at the time, had been his secret collaborator. When Marcus became ill, he wanted to report everything, but he never got the chance. He died in a car crash. An accident that I was now starting to doubt. Rage surged through my body like a wildfire. For years, I had believed that my husband's death was a cruel twist of fate. But now I realized that someone had pushed him toward that fate. Kendra, the woman who had married my son for convenience, the one who had been smiling while robbing me blind, the one who had perhaps killed my husband and then tried to get rid of me as well. My hands trembled uncontrollably. For a moment, hatred blurred my vision, but I took a deep breath. If there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that rage without intelligence is a weapon that ends up backfiring. And I wasn't about to make that mistake. I called Ethan. "I need your help again, Ethan." "Did you find something?" he asked. "More than enough, but I can't prove it alone." I asked him to come over that night. He brought his laptop and together we reviewed the system backups. "Look at this," he said, enlarging one of the recordings. "The night before the murder, someone entered the building manager's office. Can you zoom in more?" Ethan adjusted the image. Kendra's face appeared clearly, illuminated by the computer screen. She was taking out a USB drive and replacing it with an identical one. "She's tampering with the recordings," he whispered. "And not just that," I said. "She's erasing her own trail." I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with the lights off, staring at the illuminated window on the 8th floor. Kendra still had no idea that I possessed the evidence I needed, and that gave me a slight advantage. The problem was Darius. My son continued to defend her blindly. The next morning I called him needing to talk. "Son, I need you to listen to me without interrupting." "Mom, not this again." "Your father didn't die in an accident," I said firmly. There was silence on the other end of the line. "What are you saying?" "I have proof, Darius. Documents. Your wife was involved in fraud, and the man who died in the elevator was part of that scheme." "Stop it, Mom," he yelled, standing up. "Don't make up these crazy stories." "I'm not making anything up. She knew Lionel was going to talk. That's why they killed him." "She did? You're delusional." He looked at me furiously, but deep down I saw something different: fear. Fear that it might all be true. That night Kendra called me. "What did you tell Darius?" she asked in a low, restrained voice. "Only the truth. You should be careful, mother-in-law. People who stir up the past sometimes end up buried with it." "Is that a threat?" "No, it's advice." And then she hung up. I stood there looking at the phone, trembling. It was the first time she had revealed her true face. She no longer bothered to pretend. At midnight, I went down to the mailbox and found an envelope with the same blue ink as the elevator note. Inside was a single sentence. "Don't confront her alone. Wait for my signal." My heart leaped. The handwriting was the same as Lionel's. Was it possible? Could he still be alive? I ran back up the stairs, clutching the envelope to my chest. If Lionel had survived, it meant that everything could still change. And if not, someone was following his plan for him. I didn't sleep at all that night. Fear was no longer just fear. It was fuel. Pain had transformed into strategy. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped being the victim. I gathered my husband's documents, Ethan's recordings, and the note. I put everything in a red folder and wrote a phrase on the cover. "The truth doesn't hide. It waits." I stored the folder in a safe place. I knew that Kendra wouldn't stay quiet for long. I knew she would come for me, and when she did, I would be waiting. When a woman has been betrayed many times, she learns to smile even while she's digging the trap. And I had been learning that lesson my entire life. The letter with Lionel's handwriting gave me the momentum I needed. Don't confront her alone. Wait for my signal. That was the phrase that kept me going. I didn't know if it had come from him personally or from someone following in his footsteps, but the message was clear. I shouldn't rush. I spent the next few days carefully planning my next move. It had to be done calmly, without arousing suspicion, because if there was one thing that defined Kendra, it was her ability to put on a convincing facade. She knew how to manipulate. She knew how to lie. And above all, she knew how to conceal her fear. I decided to host a family dinner. It was something I hadn't done since before Marcus's death. I called Darius, using the sweetest voice I could muster. "Son, we haven't had dinner together in a while. I'd like to invite you both over." "Are you sure, Mom?" I could tell he was hesitant. "Kendra might." I cut him off. Just tell her it will be a quiet dinner, just family. Okay, I'll let her know. When I hung up the phone, I took a deep breath. Quiet, I thought to myself. This dinner will be anything but. Before I continue with my story, let me know here in the comments what you think of this so far, and what you would do in my place. Don't leave the video because what happens next will absolutely give you goosebumps. Now let's continue. That night I sat at the head of the table, carefully observing every detail. The crisp white tablecloth, the sparkling clean glasses, the flickering candlelight. Nothing should appear out of the ordinary. But concealed beneath the tablecloth, inside a black folder, rested all the evidence. The documents my husband had painstakingly collected, the damning photos, the security recordings, and the copies that Ethan had recovered from the building system. When I heard the doorbell ring, my heart leaped into my throat. Darius entered first, wearing a nervous smile. Behind him was Kendra, in her signature red dress and that calculated look that always reminded me of a cat watching its prey. Everything looks so nice, mother-in-law, she said, running her fingers across the delicate china. I didn't know you still felt like celebrating. There's always something to celebrate, honey, I said. Especially when the masks start to come off. She gave me a smile, but I could tell she still didn't quite get what I was hinting at. A few minutes later, our special guest made his grand entrance. It was Ethan. And who might this be? Kendra asked, her annoyance pretty clear. He's a friend of the family, I explained. He's been a real lifesaver for me lately. Ethan gave her a polite greeting and took the seat next to me. You could feel the tension in the air, thick as molasses. Darius tried to lighten the mood with some small talk, but the awkwardness was so intense you could practically slice it with a knife. We started eating, but it was mostly bites interspersed with glares. I was just waiting for the right moment to make my move. When Kendra went to pour the wine, I noticed her hands were barely trembling. It was a subtle tell, but it was enough for me. I knew something was definitely eating at her. Maybe she was getting the sense that she was no longer in control of the whole situation. Darius, I said, making sure my smile looked convincing. Do you happen to remember the man in the elevator? He gave an uneasy nod. Why are you bringing him up all of a sudden? Because I've uncovered some pretty interesting information. I pulled the black folder out of the drawer and set it down on the table. Kendra's face went white as a sheet. What's that? She asked, her voice a little shaky. The truth, I answered. Ethan powered up his laptop and projected an image onto the wall, one of the recovered recordings. It clearly shows Kendra entering the maintenance room and swapping out a USB drive. Darius shot to his feet. What's the meaning of this? It means, I said, that someone erased the recordings that could have proven who was responsible for Lionel Evans's death. Kendra tried to keep her cool. I have no idea what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, I said firmly. Lionel was working with Marcus. And when your father-in-law discovered your little scheme, you silenced him. The room went dead silent like a hammer had just dropped. Darius put his hands to his head. Kendra, please tell me this isn't true. Of course it's not, she screamed. That recording is a fake. Ethan gave her a steady look. It might be, if I didn't also have the financial records she doctored and the transfers that were made in her name. Kendra's face drained of all color. She tried to stand up, but Darius stopped her. What did you do, Kendra? She didn't say a word. She just started to cry, burying her face in her hands. I watched her in silence. I wasn't feeling any relief or triumph, just a deep sadness. I had loved this woman like she was my own daughter, and she had repaid me with poison. But justice, even when it's delayed, always catches up. Just then the phone in the living room rang. Ethan answered it and then handed it to me. It's for you, ma'am. An unfamiliar voice on the other end said, It's done. The file has been delivered. She won't be leaving the country. I hung up without saying a word. Kendra looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. What have you done? Nothing you didn't deserve, I replied. I simply returned the favor you did me in the elevator. Darius, completely stunned, sank back into his chair. Kendra started screaming at him. telling him it was all a lie, that I was manipulating him, that he was going to lose everything. But he wasn't even listening to her anymore. He just kept repeating, "You killed him. You killed him." She collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. And in that moment I knew it was finally over. That night, when the police officers led her away, everyone in the building came out into the hallway. Nobody said a word. They just stood there and watched as the woman in the red dress was led down the stairs in handcuffs. Ethan came up to me and asked, "Do you think you did the right thing, ma'am?" "No," I said. "I did what was necessary." When they closed the door and the silence returned, I looked up at the ceiling at the security cameras and whispered, "Thank you, Lionel." Because even though I never saw him again, I knew that he had been the first piece in a plan that had started long before I even realized it. 3 days had passed since that dinner party, 3 days of sleepless nights, barely eating, and hardly talking to anyone. The building, which had always been buzzing with gossip, now seemed to be holding its breath in silence. Nobody mentioned Kendra's name. Nobody dared to. But her shadow was still there, hanging in the air like a lingering perfume. Darius hadn't come home. I understood. He needed time to process the fact that the woman he had spent the last decade with was capable of such things. And I, though I didn't say it out loud, also needed to come to terms with the fact that the person who had hurt me the most was still alive and wanted to see me. The call came one afternoon as the sky was turning gray. "Is this Miss Era Sterling?" a firm voice asked on the other end. "Yes, it is. Inmate Kendra Reed is requesting a visit from you. She's being held in protective custody." "What does she want to see me for?" "She claims she has something to confess to you." For a moment I considered refusing. I didn't owe her anything, but something inside me urged me to accept. Maybe I needed to hear her say it. Maybe deep down I wanted to look the monster in the eye and confirm that she had once been human. The detention center reeked of dampness and disinfectant. The echoes of the heavy metal doors mingled with the distant murmur of the guards. When they led me to the visiting room, I saw her sitting behind the glass, pale, disheveled, and without makeup. Her eyes, which had once been so arrogant, were now just empty pits. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity. Just for a second. "Thank you for coming," she said, picking up the phone. "I didn't come for you, Kendra," I replied. "I came for the truth." She lowered her gaze and took a deep breath. "I didn't kill Lionel," she blurted out. "I didn't say anything." "What?" "Listen to me. I didn't kill him." "And you expect me to believe that?" "It was Darius." The world seemed to freeze. "What are you saying?" I whispered. "Lionel knew things about me, yes, but he also knew things about your son." "No," I cried. "That's a lie." "No, your son panicked. He thought that if Lionel spoke, the whole family would be ruined. He confronted him in the elevator. They fought. The blow was harder than he expected. I arrived afterward. I was paralyzed." "Why are you making this up now?" "Because I don't want to go down alone," she replied, looking at me with a chilling glint in her eyes. The guard knocked on the door, but I asked for a few more minutes. I needed to understand if what I was hearing was just another lie, or the missing piece of the puzzle. Kendra continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I tried to cover it up. I deleted the recordings, I manipulated the files, but it was all for him, Era, not for me." "And why confess now?" "Because he won't hesitate to sink you too. I know him. He's weak. He won't be able to live with the guilt." I stared at her face. There were no tears, no remorse, just an unsettling calmness, like someone who knows that their last card can still cause some serious damage. "Why did you call me here, Kendra?" I finally asked. "Because I want a deal," she said. "If you help me get out of here, I promise to give you something your husband left before he died." "What are you talking about?" "A recording. Marcus knew something was going to happen, and he left it with me." "A recording of what?" "Yes, but if I don't get out of here, no one will ever see it." I stared at her in silence. I knew it could be a trick, just another manipulation. But I also knew that Kendra never said anything without a reason. "Where is it?" I asked. She smiled. No, darling. First I want my freedom. Then I'll give you the rest." The guard opened the door. "Time's up." Kendra hung up the phone, stood up, and as she left, she said without even looking at me, "If you think you've won, you're wrong. Your family is still stained. Lionel only uncovered half of it." I returned home with my mind in turmoil. Her story was absurd, but there was something in her tone, a hint of truth hidden among the lies. Darius wasn't answering my calls, and a horrible fear began to creep into my heart. What if Kendra wasn't lying? What if my son really had been there in that elevator? I went to find the folder with all the evidence, the photos, the records, and then I remembered one crucial detail. In one of the images from the elevator, reflected in the polished steel, there was a tall, masculine shadow. It wasn't Lionel and it wasn't me. That night, before going to bed, I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was tired, but my eyes were still sharp. If my son is involved in this, I told myself, I will find out the truth. And if he isn't, then Kendra will pay for the last lie of her life, because the truth always demands its sacrifice sooner or later. There are silences that weigh more than any words. Silences that aren't just a pause but a sentence. And ever since that visit to the detention center, my son Darius's silence had become the most unbearable sound in my life. He didn't return my calls. He didn't respond to my texts. He didn't even come to see me. For days, I lived with two conflicting certainties battling it out in my head. One part of me believed that his silence was a sign of guilt, and the other that it was fear of what I might discover. The truth was slowly crumbling before me, like a wall that had been cracking for years until it finally collapses. The evidence, the names, the glances, and the elevator recording. I don't know how many times I watched it, but each time a little piece of me died inside. In the reflection on the steel behind Lionel, a tall, masculine silhouette was visible. It wasn't perfectly clear, but there was something about the way he moved, the curve of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head. Something that felt too familiar. I stopped the recording, zoomed in on the image, and I knew without a doubt that it was Darius. My heart was pounding so hard I thought my chest was going to burst. I couldn't breathe. For a moment I thought my soul was going to leave my body. Kendra hadn't lied, at least not completely. That night, the house felt colder than ever. I stayed awake in the living room with the lights off, watching the rain lash against the windows. Every drop that fell reminded me of a lie, a betrayal, a word I had chosen not to hear when I still had the chance. When Darius was a little boy, he would always come to my bed when he had nightmares. He would curl up beside me and say, "Mama, don't let the man with the dark eyes take me." And I would stroke his hair and whisper, "As long as I'm breathing, no one will ever hurt you." That night, I realized that I hadn't been able to keep that promise. I hadn't protected him from the world. And worse, I hadn't protected him from himself. Near dawn, the doorbell rang. I jumped. I walked to the door, my heart racing. When I opened it, Darius was standing there, disheveled, with dark circles under his eyes, and a lost look on his face. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mom," he said in a whisper, "I need to talk to you." For a second I wanted to slam the door in his face, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I didn't know if I had the strength to listen. But in the end, love is stronger than rage. "Come in," I whispered. He sat down on the sofa, clasping his hands together. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. All I could hear was the ticking of the clock, marking the distance between who we were and who we could never be again. "Kendra told you something, didn't she?" he finally asked. "Yes, she did. And now I want to hear it from you." He was silent. He took a deep breath and looked at me with his red-rimmed eyes. "It was an accident." That simple sentence shattered me. I sank into the chair. I wanted to believe that I had misheard him, but I knew I hadn't. Darius put his hands over his face. "Lionel came looking for me," he said between sobs. "He told me that he had proof, and that he was going to reveal everything Kendra was doing, and that if I didn't cooperate, it would ruin my career, my reputation, everything." "And what did you do?" I asked, barely holding back my tears. He recounted waiting for Lionel in the elevator, and how Lionel told him that he had information that could sink them all. I was furious, Mom. I didn't know what to do. And then, I asked, my voice trembling. He pushed me and I pushed him back. He hit his head. He fell. He wasn't moving. His voice broke. I listened to him, paralyzed, as if it weren't my son speaking, as if I were suddenly facing a complete stranger. I called Kendra, he continued. She came right away. She yelled at me, told me to calm down, that she would take care of it. And what did she do? She made me leave the scene. She said she would handle everything and that nobody should ever find out. I closed my eyes, remembering the blood on the elevator floor, Lionel's note, the fear in his eyes, the metallic reflection, the shadow behind. Everything suddenly made sense. And why didn't you tell me this before? I asked, my voice shaking. Because I was scared, Mom. Scared of losing you. You've already lost me, son. The words slipped out without me thinking, and they hurt him as much as they hurt me. Darius slumped onto the sofa, sobbing. I looked at him, not knowing whether to hug him or scream at him. Before me stood the boy who had once been my pride, my reason for living, and at the same time, the man who had destroyed what little faith I had left. Dawn began to paint the living room a sad, pale color. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was his weeping. Finally, he said something that completely disarmed me. I don't know if God can ever forgive me, but I need you to. I stared at him. He waited for my response, but I couldn't give it to him right away. Forgiveness. What a huge word. Easy to say when nothing has been lost. But when everything has been lost, it weighs like a stone in your chest. I can't promise you that, I told him. But I can try. He got up and hugged me. I felt his body shaking against mine. Just like when he was a little boy and had a fever. For a moment I was his mother again, just his mother, without judgment, without anger, without fear. But in some corner of my soul, a voice whispered that love shouldn't blind me again, and that if I truly loved him, I had to let him face the consequences of his actions. We broke apart in silence. Kendra manipulated you, I told him. But that doesn't excuse what you did. I know, he whispered. And that's why I'm turning myself in. What? I already spoke with a lawyer. I want to confess. I can't keep living with this. My legs started to tremble. Don't do it. I have to, Mom. You taught me that mistakes aren't something you hide. They're something you face. Not like this. There's no other way. His eyes were filled with tears, but I also saw a glimmer of something I hadn't seen in years. A piece of his true self. And I knew that I couldn't stop him. That night after he left, the house fell silent again. A new, different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of guilt or sadness. It was the silence before the final judgment. I sat down in front of the portrait of Marcus, my husband. I spoke to him in a low voice, as if he could actually hear me. Honey, he's going to turn himself in. He says he wants to do it to reclaim some shred of dignity. In the darkness, Marcus's face seemed to look at me with a mix of compassion and serenity. I closed my eyes and for a brief moment I thought I heard his voice. Don't destroy your son, Era. Let him find his own salvation through his guilt. I cried. I cried with all my heart, because I finally understood that a mother's love isn't measured by how much she protects, but by how much she's willing to let go. The next morning the phone rang. It was the case agent. Miss Sterling, we've found something you should hear. I went down to the precinct. In a small room, they played a recording that they had recovered from Kendra's files. As Marcus's voice filled the room, I felt a lump forming in my throat. If you're listening to this, it means that everything has gone wrong. Kendra isn't who she seems. But if something happens to me, don't seek revenge. Look after Darius. He's not evil. He's just blind. Don't let hatred drag him down any further than he already is. If you ever have to choose between the truth and your son, choose to save his soul. I covered my mouth to stifle a scream. Tears blurred my vision. Marcus had known. He had seen the storm coming, and yet he had tried to save us all. I returned home, my soul in pieces. Darius was waiting for me at the door, his eyes swollen and his face resigned. "I've made my decision, Mom," he said. "I'm going to turn myself in. I can't keep running. I don't want my life to be just another lie." We hugged in silence. I felt his heart beating against mine, desperate, and I knew that there was no turning back. "Whatever you do," I whispered in his ear, "do it with dignity." He pulled away, kissed my forehead and left. I watched him walk down the hallway without looking back. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes the purest form of love is letting your children pay for their own mistakes. That night, the rain returned. The sound of the water against the windows was like a sad but serene melody. I lit a candle and sat down in front of Marcus's portrait. "I looked after him, honey," I told him. "Just like you asked, but I also had to let him go." The flame flickered softly, as if in response. And then I understood everything. Redemption doesn't always come with glory or absolution. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the form of surrender, in the acceptance that no one can truly escape their own shadow. I got up, opened the window and let the cool air of dawn flow in. I took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, because I understood that forgiveness doesn't erase the pain, but it allows you to live without being consumed by it. And that night, while the city slept, I realized that I too was finally ready to start over. They say the truth always comes out eventually, but what nobody tells you is what to do when it finally does. Because when the truth comes knocking, it doesn't bring relief. It brings consequences. The morning after Darius turned himself in, I woke up with a strange feeling. It wasn't sadness or relief. It was as if, for the first time in years, my soul had room to breathe. However, the picture was still incomplete because I still needed to understand what had truly happened in that elevator, why Lionel had left me that note, and why, even after his death, I still felt like he was watching over me. That afternoon, while tidying up Marcus's desk, I found a small metal keychain with the name Evans engraved on the back. It was so ordinary that at first I didn't pay much attention to it, but something inside me made me turn it over. On the inside was a tiny slot. I inserted a needle, and a hidden cover popped open. Inside was a memory card. I turned on the computer. There was a single file with no name. I clicked on it. The screen filled with a grainy recording taken with a security camera. My husband, Marcus, appeared, sitting in his office. Next to him was a young man in his 40s, with a patchy beard and tired eyes. It was Lionel Evans. "Marcus, if something happens to me, I want this recording to reach my wife. She needs to know the truth." "Lionel, are you sure about this, Mr. Sterling? If this comes out, your daughter-in-law won't be the only one involved." "I know, Marcus, but I can't keep quiet any longer. Kendra isn't acting alone. There's someone else." "Who is it, Lionel?" Marcus sighed heavily. "It's my son. Darius signed some documents without knowing what he was doing. She used him. But if this continues, it's going to end up ruining his life. If you can protect Era and him, please do it, Lionel." "I'll do what I can, Mr. Sterling. But if something happens to you, they'll know it was her," Marcus replied. "And if I die, tell them it wasn't an accident." The video cut off abruptly. I stared at the screen for several minutes, unable to move. Lionel had been my husband's guardian angel, and then mine. He had known what was coming and had left me that note, not only to save me from Kendra, but also from my own son. That night, I went back to the condo building. I needed to see that place one last time. The manager let me in, even though the unit had already been sealed off. The hallway was deserted. The lights flickered with a soft hum. The elevator remained closed, but the dried blood still marked the floor like a permanent scar. I knelt down in front of the door and rested my forehead against the cold metal. "Thank you, Lionel," I whispered, because now I finally understood everything. 10 minutes after he handed me the note, when I ran out of there pretending to be sick, he hadn't gone down alone. I replayed the scene in my mind as if it were happening again. The elevator doors closed. Lionel was inside. Darius, nervous and agitated, was waiting for him downstairs. They argued. Lionel had tried to protect me and warn him. Darius, blinded by fear, had pushed him. Lionel had fallen, and when Kendra had arrived, it was already too late. She had taken advantage of the tragedy to erase evidence, manipulate recordings, and eliminate any traces. And all that time I, blinded by rage, had hated her, never knowing that deep down, she had only been covering up my own son's crime. The next day dawned under a gray sky. I received a call from the prosecutor. "Miss Sterling, your son has partially confessed. He says it was an accident and that there was no premeditation." "And what's going to happen to him?" "The judge will decide, but his statements have helped to shed light on the entire corruption network. Thanks to you, the case will be resolved justly." I hung up the phone without saying a word. Justice? What an empty word when everything has already been lost. The following weeks were filled with journalists, lawyers, and curious neighbors. The building was abuzz with rumors. Some people said that there was a curse, while others said that the old woman on the 7th floor me was a vengeful witch. I learned to ignore it all. People always look for entertainment in the suffering of others. But one morning when I went down to check the mailbox, I found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Thank you for believing in me until the end." I couldn't help but smile. It was his handwriting, trembling, hurried, but unmistakable. I didn't know if he had left it before he turned himself in or if someone had placed it there on his behalf, but deep down it didn't really matter. It was the closure I needed. In time, Darius was given a reduced sentence. The judge took into consideration that it had been an accident, and that there had been no intention to kill. I attended the trial every day, sitting in the back row, not to judge him. But I was there to support him, even though he didn't always have the courage to look me in the eye. During his final statement in court, he said something that brought tears to my eyes. "I'm not asking for clemency," he stated. "I only want my mother to know that everything I am, both the good and the bad, I learned from her." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. In the midst of so much pain and heartache, those words felt like my own personal redemption. When he was released from prison 2 years later, he made a point of coming to see me. He had aged considerably, but his eyes held a new, quiet humility. We hugged for a long time, just standing there in silence. We didn't need to talk about the past. It was no longer necessary to rehash old wounds. Forgiveness had moved beyond being just a word. It had become a real place where we could both breathe freely. "So, what are you going to do now?" I asked him, curious about his future plans. "Leave," he replied with a newfound resolve. "Start somewhere else, but this time, I'm going to build my life on honesty instead of lies." And shortly after that, Kendra filed for divorce from jail. "I don't ever want to hear from her again," she stated firmly. I simply nodded in silence, understanding her desire for a clean break. As he turned to leave, I watched him walk down the hallway of the building, just like he had done the night he turned himself in to the authorities. Only this time he wasn't running away from something. He was seeking a chance to live again, to create a better future for himself. Months drifted by. The building, which had once felt heavy and filled with shadows, gradually began to fill with life and light. There were new neighbors moving in, children laughing and playing in the hallways, and colorful flowers blooming in the windowsills. I too started going out more, rediscovering the simple joys of life. I returned to my gardening, enjoyed reading in the park, and watched the sunsets without that heavy feeling of guilt weighing me down. One afternoon, while I was outside pruning my rose bushes, a young woman approached me. She had soft brown hair and kind, light eyes. "Are you Miss Sterling?" she inquired politely. "Yes, I am. I'm Lionel Evans's daughter," she said. I was completely speechless, caught off guard by her sudden appearance. "My father talked about you a lot," she continued with a shy smile. "He always said that if anything ever happened to him, I should come and thank you for everything." "Thank me?" I asked, confused by her words. "Yes, because he said you represented what he never had, a clear and clean conscience." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. I gently stroked her cheek, offering her a comforting gesture. "No, honey, it was the other way around," I said softly. He taught me not to give up hope, even in the darkest of times. She then handed me a small, unassuming box. This was his, she explained. He always kept it with your name written on it. Inside the box I found a simple silver pendant with a poignant inscription. 10 minutes can change a life. And in that moment I finally understood everything. Lionel had known that those crucial 10 minutes between the moment he handed me the note and his own death would be the turning point in my story, the catalyst for everything that followed. 10 minutes for me to get out of that elevator, save myself from danger, and begin uncovering the truth. That night, I lit a candle in remembrance of him, and for Marcus, and for all the silences that had ultimately ended in screams. I sat by the window gazing out at the city lights, and contemplated everything we had lived through. All the hardships and pain. How life can be so easily twisted and altered by a single decision. How love and guilt can become so easily entangled. And how, in spite of everything, there is always a path to find redemption and healing. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret uncovering this whole complicated story, if I wish I had just left things buried in the past. And I always tell them no, because while the truth can certainly be painful, lies are like a slow-acting poison that corrupts everything it touches. I would much rather deal with a clean, honest wound than live a life that is slowly rotting away with secrets. My son now lives far away from here. He calls me every week without fail. His voice sounds different now. Calmer, more serene, more at peace. Sometimes he even sends me handwritten letters, always signed in the same heartfelt way. Your son who learned to tell the truth. And every time I read those words I feel a deep sense of peace, knowing that in some way both Marcus and Lionel can finally rest in peace too. Today, as I write these last lines, the warm sun is streaming in through the window. The building elevator is finally working again reliably. No one is afraid of it anymore. It's just a normal elevator now. Sometimes I hear the children playing near it, laughing and giggling without any knowledge of all the dark secrets that this place once held. I watch them from my balcony with a hot cup of tea in my hands, and I think that perhaps life is really just like that elevator. Constantly going up and down, taking us through moments that we think will last forever, until someone leaves us a note that changes everything. I smile gently, close my eyes for a moment and whisper, "Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, life." Because 10 minutes later, I finally understood that it's not about how much pain and suffering we can endure, but about how much love we are capable of preserving and nurturing after losing absolutely everything. They say that when a woman reaches a certain age, she no longer fears anything in the world. But that's simply not true. She just learns to fear different things. She no longer fears physical pain or the loneliness of being alone. Instead, she fears the possibility of forgetting who she truly was, of losing her sense of self. I, Layla Sterling, went through the deepest darkness that a mother can possibly imagine. I witnessed the death of a good man. I uncovered a web of betrayal and lies within my own home. And I came to understand that love, even the kind of love that we believe will last forever, can also be used as a weapon if it's wielded in the wrong way. For years I truly believed that life had taken far too much from me, that I had been robbed of everything that mattered. But now I understand that it was actually giving me back what was most essential. The truth even though it hurts, freedom even though it took time to achieve, and peace even if it arrived in silence. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means remembering the past without allowing those memories to destroy you from the inside out. And when you finally achieve that state of grace, when you can look back on your life without feeling resentment or bitterness, then life finally returns your smile, rewarding your perseverance and strength. Sometimes I wake up in the dead of night and stare out the window. The building is quiet and still, sleeping soundly. The elevator lights flicker gently in the darkness, and I like to think that somewhere out there, Lionel and Marcus are still watching over me, protecting me. Perhaps they are smiling too, knowing that their sacrifices were not in vain, that their actions had a positive impact on the world. My son Darius now lives far away from me. We write letters to each other every week, sharing our thoughts and feelings. There are no more reproaches or accusations, just simple, honest, and sincere words. because we both learned that the truth, however painful it may be, ultimately unites people more strongly than any well-spoken lie ever could. And if I can leave you with anything today, you who are listening to my story, it is this valuable lesson. Don't ever let fear silence your voice. Don't let the guilt and shame of others steal your voice or your sense of self-worth. And above all else, don't ever confuse love with obedience or control. True love never forces you to give up who you are, or what you believe in. Sometimes all it takes is a simple note, a kind gesture, or even a cleverly faked illness to completely change the course of an entire life, to set you on a new and unexpected path. And though the past cannot be rewritten or erased, you can learn to tell your story without tears, without the weight of bitterness and regret holding you back. And now, before I say goodbye, I want to extend a special invitation to all of you. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so, and leave a like on this video if this story touched your heart in some way. This helps me to see that you are keeping me company, that you are listening to my words, and that I am not walking alone on this journey of memories and scars. And please take a moment to leave a comment below, telling me what city you are watching from. I would truly love to read them and know where your voice is coming from, because every story, every comment, is proof that there are still people out there who feel deeply, who cry openly, and who still believe in the transformative power of the truth. I'm Layla Sterling, and this was my story. A story of pain, of redemption, and of true unwavering love. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And always remember, the truth may be late in arriving, but it always eventually arrives.